Good morning, Professor Mansour, Professor Tom, colleagues from Brunel, doctoral students and colleagues from AhliaUniversityBH. Thank you for inviting me here today. What I thought I would do is, when Talal suggested I talk about theory development, I thought, well, I could talk about theory development, but in my view, I think most of the audience would fall asleep fairly quickly. So I thought, let me put theory development in some context, and let me kind of frame theory development not just as a thing which kind of stands apart from everything else that doctoral students do or that we do as part of our publications, but let me put it in the context of what it means to do a PhD, what it means in our overall research. Actually, when I was putting this presentation together, I thought to myself, if I was sitting where you are, what would be the first question that would go through my head? Okay, what's the first question? And actually, the first question that would go through my head is the question, why? Why? Why should I spend the next however many minutes we have together? Why should I spend this time listening to this guy who flew in last night at 2 o'clock in the morning, got 4 hours sleep, and has turned up today, right? Why? Why should I listen to this guy, right? And I thought to myself, I better think about this why question, okay? And at one level, the why question is very easy to answer. The reason why you are here today is because Dr. Talal told you had to be here. You see, you had no choice, okay? You had no choice. You had to be here. So I just want you to think you're kind of in a 5-star posh hotel, but actually it's a prison for the next little while. Can you see? You had no choice. So, but beyond that, why, right? So I thought to myself, I better start to think about this. And I started to come up with some questions I think you might be interested in thinking about and thinking about answering. Like, why are you doing any doctoral studies? Why is research so important anyway? Why do you need to think about theory development? And you do your research as a doctoral student, the question that people will keep asking you is, so what's your contribution to knowledge? What's your contribution to theory? You will hear this question over and over and over again, okay? And I have to tell you, there aren't many things that supervisors and senior academics can have fun with in terms of doctoral students. But I'll tell you one area of great fun is just asking a doctoral student, so what's your theoretical contribution? What theory are you developing? It's the equivalent of taking a baseball bat and going bang. Yeah, okay, you see? And it's real fun because then you watch the doctoral student and go, oh my God, I have no idea. What's this about? And you say, but it's a bit of fun, right? Whenever all else fails, you can always come back to that question. And I think you need to be able to answer that. Why do we emphasize methodology? Why are you doing all this stuff anyway? All right? So I thought to myself, if I was sitting where you are, and I had to listen to some guy kind of going on a bit, then I might want some answers to some questions. Okay, so those are some of the questions I want to kind of look at. And reading boring literature, honestly, you have not, if you've read through an Administrative Science Quarterly article and stayed awake, honestly, you need a medal. And they're impossible to stay awake. You read the first 3 paragraphs and you fall off to sleep. And you almost need to have 3 or 4 cups of really strong coffee before you even start one, right? But you've got to so why do you need to do all this stuff? That's kind of what I want to do. And so what I want to do is really take a step back from some of the detail for a minute, okay? Take a step back. If you come to Brunel, and you come to do your first degree, a bachelor's, irrespective of what it is. Actually, when you stop and think about your own degree, your first degree, what was that degree trying to do? What was it trying to achieve? And what it was trying to achieve, it was whatever your subject was, it was trying to get you to learn a language. It was trying to get you to learn the meanings of some words at quite a basic level. So if you did your first degree in engineering, or if you did your first degree in history, or whatever it is you did your first degree in, what that first degree was doing was teaching you some basic principles about that subject area, some basic rules about how that subject area operates, some basic meanings behind some of the concepts of that subject area. So you got your first degree. Then you decided, what I want to do is actually I want to go and do a master's. And actually what a master's does, which is the next level up, is it gets you to take those words, take those principles, and begin to apply them, to start to think, what do these words and principles mean in practice? What do they mean out there? So if you've done your master's, you probably had some case studies that you had to work your way through. You probably worked in groups. You probably did a whole bunch of stuff which took some of those theories and said, how do these theories map to the real world? And so you got your master's. And now you're embarking on a PhD. And this is why a PhD is so very different to a master's. This is why a PhD is truly the next level up. Because when you do a PhD, what you're really doing is you are writing the principles. You are writing the doctrine. You are getting a doctorate. And that word doctorate, at its root, can change to doctrine. And doctrine is a set of principles. So whatever your subject area is, you, as part of your PhD, you, as part of your doctorate, you are writing the principles for the future. And if you do your PhD thoroughly and carefully, and you start to think about what you are doing, actually, those principles that you are creating are the principles that come back to be taught at some future time. Which is why doing a PhD is very different to anything you've done before. When you do a PhD, you are creating the future. You're creating the future of knowledge, of what people may well be learning further down the track. So part of what I want to get you to think about when you're doing a PhD is this is not just a purely academic thing, which it is at one level, but it's not a purely academic thing. Actually, this comes back to what you will be teaching your students at some future time. So if you're going to do a PhD, if you're going to do some research, okay, and Professor Talal will tell you, we have a thing called the Research Excellence Framework, which assesses all our research across the UK. And that research, every publication that we do, has to pass 3 tests. And the 3 tests that they look for are down here, okay? So when they talk about it being original, what they're talking about is, so how are you extending knowledge? How are you extending theory? What's your contribution? What are you moving forward? What are people going to say? This is different. This is new. We haven't thought about it in this way. They want to know that the research that is being done is rigorous. They want to know that the research that's being done is not somebody who had an idea while they were, having breakfast this morning and came up with this great idea and are now thinking, okay, having come up with this idea, I'm going to now write it up and sell it to everybody. Yeah, that's not what this is about. This is about showing that you are rigorous in terms of your work. And significance is about your contribution, and it's about your impact. What is the impact that your work is having? Okay, so what I want to do is really start to get you to think about when you talk about theory development, when you're trying to find your way through this little bowl of spaghetti, then actually what you're really grappling with are those 3 areas. Okay, so I just want to unpack those. So theoretical development. So this is where every PhD student starts, right? This is where every PhD student starts. That, by the way, is meant to be a picture of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, it's the biggest ocean in the world. Okay, and every doctoral student comes to their PhD thinking, I'm going to solve some really big problem, okay? I'm going to solve something that hasn't been dealt with before. This is going to be my area. And I'm going to do it all, and I'm going to get it done in 3 years, and my gosh, it's going to be great, okay? This PhD is going to lead me directly to my Nobel Prize, okay? There's no in-between stages, straight through to the Nobel Prize committee, right? So this is your little PhD student with their little campfire thinking, I'm going to boil the ocean, okay? And anything I say that might remind you of someone you know is purely coincidental. And I'll tell you, many a PhD student, okay, has tried to kind of solve the problems of the world as part of their doctoral studies. But honestly, it's a really difficult thing to do. And if you haven't heard your supervisor say this, because you're just starting out, you will hear your supervisor say, narrow your work. And then you think, okay, I've narrowed it. And then they say, narrow your work. And you think, I've narrowed it. Yeah, and you think, no, this is still a bucket full. And then they go, no, I want a mug full. No, it's a teaspoonful. You see, because that's all you're going to do is you're going to heat this teaspoon here. So what I want you to think about is you need to get some focus in your work. If you're going to have impact, if you're going to be rigorous, it requires focus. And this area of getting focus is really important because actually focus is about discipline, okay? It's about discipline, and more importantly, it's about mental discipline. It's about saying, I know I want to swim the Pacific Ocean, but actually in the time I have available, with the energy and the resources I have, I'm only going to do the first 50 meters, and I'm not going to go beyond the depth of where my feet can touch the ground, and that's all I'm going to do. So it's about having that kind of discipline to say, this is my area, this is my space, and then, more importantly, being able to defend it at your viva. I don't know if from the back you can read down at the bottom, it says, if I have seen a little further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, and it's been attributed to Isaac Newton, but apparently it's been attributed to other people as well. Okay. And actually, the heading on this slide would read Literature Review. Yes. So I was talking about all those boring papers that you have to read. Those boring papers are really important, okay? Because by reading and reading and reading and reading till you just think, I can't read anymore. I've run out of words to read. At that point, you still need to read, okay? Because what you are doing is you're looking at what other people have said. You're learning from others. You're learning from people who've gone before you, who've said, yeah, you can look in this area, but actually this area is not going to give you a huge amount. Or you can look in this area, and actually in this area, out of the 3 or 4 things, there's one which is really important. You can look in what other people have said, and they'll tell you that actually if you use this method, here are some big dangers. Here are some red flags. And so understanding the literature, being on top of the literature, knowing what other people have said in your field is absolutely critical. Because if you're going to say, this is my contribution to knowledge, this is my development of theory, this is what I am adding, which no one else has added, and it's new, it's different, then actually you can't make that kind of statement. You can't stand and defend your work unless you have seen what other people have done. So I need to be careful because I've got 2 potential students here in the room, and they may not want to be associated with me after this, okay? But out of my own personal experience, when I was doing my PhD, in the final tally of references that appeared in the back of my PhD, I'd say probably from recollection about 275 references appeared in the back of my PhD. And then to get to the 275, my database of articles that I had read probably contained about 1,200, 1,300 articles. And those are the ones that I read and cataloged. There were others that I read and didn't catalog. Okay. So what I'm saying is, if you want to be an expert in this area, you can't be an expert unless you have seen what other people have said. You've got to walk around your subject, look at it from every angle possible in order to make that contribution. Some of you may well have seen a couple of these slides if you attended my session in late last year. I just want to talk about unit of analysis, okay, which is part of narrowing down that Pacific Ocean, okay? It's saying which bit am I really interested in? And it doesn't matter whether you do quantitative work, whether you do qualitative work, or whether you use mixed methods. Leave the methods to one side for a moment, right? I want you to think about what is your unit of analysis. What's the boundary around which you are drawing your research? Which bit of the Pacific Ocean are you going to actually say, this is my area, this is where I'm researching? And that, broadly speaking, is what I refer to as the unit of analysis. And so you can think about unit of analysis at many different levels, okay? And it's not that there's a right level or a wrong level, these are just different levels. So you can do research which is at the level of an individual. So you can say, actually, what I'm really interested in, if I pick up from what Tom was saying a little earlier, I'm really interested in entrepreneurs. And I'm really interested in how entrepreneurs behave in the first, 3 years of starting up a business. So actually, your unit of analysis is the individual entrepreneur. You could say, actually, I'm interested in a group. I'm interested in what happens in a department. I'm interested in what happens with a group of entrepreneurs get together. I'm interested in incubators. And incubators require lots of different people to come together to form a group. Right? So maybe that's my unit of analysis. Or you might be interested in a particular organization or an industry. Okay? Whatever it is, you've got to specify what your unit of analysis is. And it's really important to get some clarity in terms of that unit of analysis, because when it comes to deciding your sample, when it comes to deciding whether it's a theoretical sample if you're using case studies, or a statistical sample if you're doing quantitative work, you're going to draw from a population based on your unit of analysis. So thinking about your unit of analysis is really important, okay, and getting it clear in terms of what you are looking to do. And this unit of analysis also has quite an interesting interplay, or quite an interesting kind of relationship with the theory that you develop. So if you stop and think about it, there are certain theories that have been developed because the original theory and the original researchers that came up with that theory said, we're looking at the industry. By the way, the size of the circles have I just undid the previous one. They just happen to be that size. You end up with a theory where that has been developed from the perspective of the industry. There are other theories that have been developed at the level of a group or the level of an individual. And why these having a clear fix on your unit of analysis is important is because you don't want to pick a theory that has been developed at the level of the industry and then try to apply it to the individual. Or you don't want to pick a theory that's been developed at the level of the individual and then try to apply it at the level of an industry. It's not to say that you can't do it. You could do. But equally, if you take a size, I don't know, I take a size 9 shoe, right? I could try to get my foot into a size 8 shoe. It'd be very uncomfortable. Can you see? It wouldn't be very nice, and I couldn't walk very far with it. Can you see? Much better if I actually got my size 9 shoe for my size 9 foot, and then I can go wherever I like. So if you don't understand your unit of analysis, or if your unit of analysis keeps changing as you go through your doctoral work, then every time you change your unit of analysis, you've just got to make sure that whatever theory you use to do your study still matches with that unit of analysis. Okay? So there needs to be some level of alignment between these things. Otherwise, you could end up in a situation where it becomes very difficult to defend your research. So this area of theory, what I want to do is get you to think about theory in a certain way. And I want to use a metaphor, I want to use a way of thinking about theory, which is, a theory is a bit like a lens, okay? So, tell me, for those of you like me who have to wear glasses, okay? For those of you like me who have to wear glasses. You know when you go to the optician, and the optician says, okay, let me check your eye, right? Eyes. And they say, can you read that chart over there? Yeah? And then you think, okay, I can read the top line, but the middle line's not so clear. So you know they put those rather heavy, clunky glasses, and then they drop these lenses into those glasses, right? I want you to think about theory a bit like that. Because they put a lens in, and they go, can you see this clearly or less clearly? And you go, I see it more clearly, or less clearly. Well, theory is a bit like that. Theory allows you to focus. It allows you to see certain things about the subject that you are studying. But just as theory allows you to see certain things really clearly, there are other things it doesn't allow you to see. So for every theory that you read about, for every theory that you use, there are some things it'll show you very clearly, and there are other things that actually you think, I'm just not going to see this at all. So what I want you to think about when you start to choose your theory that you're going to use for your study is theory is a way of seeing, and it's a way of not seeing. It's a way of focusing on some things, and it's a way of not focusing on other things in your unit of analysis. Okay? Did you like that? God, it took me hours to do this, okay? I hope you didn't miss that. That was not the point at which to blink, okay? It took me hours to do that. So let me just build on this idea a little bit more in terms of theory, okay? Let me build on this idea. And there's a very interesting article by Wetton where he talks about what is it that makes up a theory. And so what he says, in a very simple way, is that actually when you talk about a theory answers various questions. So every theory answers a question, what is in this theory? What makes up this theory? And there may be variables, constructs. I'm not going to read all those out to you. I'm sure you can read them from where you are. But there are things that make up a theory. There are things that when you pull this theory apart, you can start to see the building blocks of the theory. A good theory answers the how question. So if there are 4 building blocks, or 4 parts to this theory, how are these things connected? What are the relationships? And I just love when doctoral students present me in case I'm sitting in your presentations later, you might want to clock this question, right? When they come up with their lovely models, okay, and they tell me all about box A, right? This box here. What this is looking at, I know, this variable and this construct and these are the hypotheses here. And then this box has an arrow which connects to this box here. And they tell me all about this box here. And then there's another arrow and then there's another box. And I go, thank you for telling me about the boxes. Can I just ask, tell me about the arrow? It's like, what? It's like, tell me about the arrow. And they go, what do you mean tell you about the arrow? It's an arrow. And I go, yeah, but this arrow is important, right? This arrow is really important because this arrow is indicating how your boxes are connected. And I want to know, on what basis are you connecting these boxes? Like, why is the arrow only going in one direction? Why not two directions? Why is the arrow a nice thin line other than that's what Word gives you as a default? Yes, you see, it has to go beyond, well, that's the Word default arrow. Yeah, that's the one I use. Why isn't it thick arrow? Why isn't it a dotted arrow? Is it a thin arrow in every case or in some cases? Tell me about the relationship between your constructs, the relationship between your variables. Why are you connecting these things? On what basis are you connecting these things? Which really goes down to the next area in terms of those connections, okay? Every theory has a set of underpinning assumptions. If you read your articles carefully, if you read the work in the literature carefully, what you begin to see is that actually those authors will say this theory or this set of constructs works in ... When you're talking about very large organizations, when you're talking about organizations that are facing significant turbulence, or when you're talking about individuals who are under serious pressure, they will talk about certain conditions, certain assumptions, at which point this theory works, and then when it doesn't work. Okay? So you need to think about what are the assumptions you are making when you are developing your theory. And an area that lots of PhD students don't want to go, okay? And it's you can see it, because when I read this section, and very often if I'm reading a thesis, I start with this section, and then I go to the front, which is the limitations section, okay? And the limitations section, some of them are just beautiful, right? This work has a number of limitations. That's the first sentence. The next sentence. But these limitations are not major limitations, I should tell you. That second sentence. Actually, these limitations were really strengths of the work. It's like, oh, right, okay. So these are not limitations. These are now suddenly flipped to strengths. Okay, so there are no... Honestly, every piece of work has limitations. You see, you're not going to swim the whole of the Pacific Ocean. So you might as well say, I didn't swim the Pacific Ocean. Actually, I only chalked out this little bit of the ocean over here. And actually, even when I made this my unit of analysis and looked at just this bit here, actually, you know what? I didn't swim all of it. I could only swim in a straight line up and a straight line down. So I didn't look 1 meter this way, and I didn't look 1 meter that way. You might as well say it. Because when someone's read your work, they'll figure it out. They'll know you only swam in a straight line up and down. You didn't look 1 meter this way and 1 meter that way. And a really horrible external examiner, I'm not one of those. But a really horrible external examiner will look at the limitations, yes, and then go, this person swam in straight lines. They didn't put a meter either side as a limitation, right? Because they didn't swim there and they didn't swim there. Tell you what, my opening question. So tell me, what was it like in the water a meter away from where you swam? Oh, that's a lovely question. It's like, what? I didn't swim there. I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Tell me about it, because it's not a limitation of your work. So did you not? Therefore, you must have looked at it. No, I didn't look at it. Oh, it is a limitation of your work. Well, it's a strength of my work. Oh, it's a strength. Can you say? Whatever you do, you've got to be honest with yourself and say, where is this working and where isn't this working, okay? And you've got to be really clear about what those conditions are, okay? So when you start to think about theory as a lens, which allows you to see some things and not see other things, and think about theory in terms of what the constructs are, how are they connected, why are they connected, why are they connected in this way, and what are the limitations? Just as a way of thinking about theory. And I appreciate that what I've done is kind of talked at almost a theoretical level, almost at a kind of conceptual level. So let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, So you've got stakeholder salience theory and institutional theory. Okay, these are two very separate theories. But if you dig under the skin of these two theories, stakeholder salience theory, just taking them through the same questions that I had on the previous slide, okay? Bless you. So what are the different types of stakeholders? So this is the key question that stakeholder salience theory is asking. What are the types of stakeholders that exist? And actually, how do we know who these are? And what differentiates these various stakeholders? What makes some more important than others? Okay, that's what stakeholder salience theory is trying to get to. And the answer to the what question is, you can measure a stakeholder salience based on their power, based on their legitimacy, and based on urgency. And then it says, how are these connected? Well, they're connected in a way of saying, how much does a stakeholder have of those three things? And we can put some measurements in place for how these work. And why these three? Because actually it is possible to start to assess what these are. So you can begin to see that stakeholder salience theory has some very specific variables that are connected in very specific ways that are aimed at seeing things in a certain way. You can also begin to see that stakeholder salience theory would be very useful at maybe the individual level, may also be very useful at a group level. So in a group of people, take a board of directors, for example, or take a project team, you could begin to say which of the members of this project team are more important and which are less important. Can you begin to see? But actually, taking stakeholder salience theory and saying, I'm going to apply it to an industry, I'm going to apply it to the oil and gas industry, where's that size 8 shoe? Can you see? It doesn't quite fit. But you take institutional theory, which says, what is it that makes organizations more similar, and what is it that makes organizations less similar? More homogeneous or less homogeneous? And they say there are three things. Organizations become more similar because they're pressurized to. There's some coercive reason. Mimetic is because they copy each other. They mime or they copy each other. And normative is because there is a view that this is what we should be doing in this industry or in this sector. So how are these various constructs related? Well, different companies, according to the theory, different companies respond to their environment in those kinds of ways. And those responses bring them closer and closer together. And then you say, well, why these three? And according to this theory, and this is from the original piece of work, they came up with three assumptions. There are either legislative pressures, professionalization, so people working for a particular profession bring organizations closer together, or because actually companies copy each other's practices. So you take the oil and gas sector, for example. Well, in the oil and gas sector, you can begin to see that certain institutions, certain organizations in that sector operate in very similar ways. So BP, Shell, and others may well share safety practices because it's in no one's interest. It's in no one's interest to put individuals in a situation where they're not in a safe environment when they're out on a rig. You see? So they copy each other. Actually, when you now look at the whole area about regulation and corporate social responsibility, you look at the whole accounting and reporting mechanisms in place, well, you can begin to see that institutions, companies, are starting to become very similar. The banks are starting to become very similar because they're having to follow certain legislative, certain piece of legislation, certain regulations that cause all of them to operate in the same way. You can see that trying to take institutional theory and apply it down to the level of the individual itself then becomes problematic. If you see what I mean. That's not what it was designed to do. Okay? So I just want to kind of give you an idea as to how those work together. And what you can begin to do is you can begin to say, actually, for my piece of work, I'm interested in taking multiple perspectives. For me to really get the focus on what I'm looking for, actually what I need to do is use 2 or 3 different lenses and overlay these lenses so that what I'm really interested in is where the 3 lenses or the 3 theories come together. That's the bit I'm interested in. So just to kind of give you an idea as to how the theories work. Moving on to methodologies, okay? Moving on to methodologies. Let me, if you haven't read Beryl and Morgan, okay, if you haven't read Beryl and Morgan, 1979, then you have missed a very important part, in my view anyway, of your development. I would strongly recommend at least picking up and reading the first chapter, okay? I have to tell you, beyond the first 3 chapters, it is like having your tooth pulled without any pain relief, okay? It's a very hard read, very hard read. But the first 3 chapters are really good, okay? Because in the first 3 chapters, they introduce, in a nice, simple way, this notion of ontology, epistemology, and methodology. What ends up happening with most doctoral students is they go straight to the methodology and they go, I want to do quantitative work, or I want to do qualitative work. And the question I ask is, why? Why do you want to do either quantitative or qualitative work? And the only way you're going to answer the why question in terms of your choice of methodology is by dealing with the first 2 areas. So ontology is all about what is your view of reality? And this is a very interesting question in the internet age that we live in, okay? What is your view of reality? Is reality something which is, dare I say it, out there, external to human beings, external to people, or is reality something that we make up in our heads? Something which is in here. And that is a highly philosophical question, okay? And when you stop and think about it, the letters P, H, D, everybody focuses on the D, which is the doctorate bit, and everybody forgets the P, which is the philosophical bit. This is the philosophical bit. This is the bit that says, how do I think about what is real and what isn't real? And this is a highly philosophical question. And if you've been following the stories around fake news and all this kind of stuff, it really gets to the heart of what is real. And is it real if we just make it up in our heads? Is it still real or not? So that's that question there. And depending on what your ontology is, you then need to deal with epistemology. And epistemology says, so this thing called knowledge, this thing that we want to know, how do we get to know things? Do we get to know things because we think knowledge itself can be measured? Is knowledge a bit like this table? Because this table, if I had a little ruler or a measuring tape, I can measure this table. I can tell you how long it is, how wide it is, how the depth is. I can measure this to every level of detail. I can know about this table. And I can tell you about this table in very specific terms. But actually, is knowledge hard, or is it really kind of soft? Actually, you can't know it. Knowledge is what we experience. Knowledge is what we have going on a day-to-day basis. We develop knowledge on a day-to-day basis. Knowledge evolves, it emerges, it may disappear. Actually, knowledge is socially constructed. We think there is a good way to teach students. And we know there is a good way to teach students. And because we know there is a good way to teach students, we go into our lectures doing the same thing we've done before. And we agree across the university or across the organization, this is the way to do it. It's a social construction. There's no absolute right or wrong. This is a deeply philosophical question of what is knowledge and how do you measure it. And until you've tackled those two questions, saying that you're doing quantitative work or qualitative work, it's not entirely meaningless, but it's the answer to a question without having the context for why you have chosen this methodology. So if you think that knowledge is real and it's out there, reality is something which is tangible, if epistemologically you think knowledge is hard and tangible, then you're likely to go down a quantitative route. If you think knowledge is in here, reality is in here, it's socially constructed, knowledge is not something you can measure, it's not hard and definable, then you're more likely to go down a qualitative route. You see. And then you've got students who say, well, I'm just going to use mixed methods. Well, back to my question, why? Because philosophically now you're really all over the place. You're saying, I'm going to cover everything. Hey, that's fine if that's what you want to do, but why are you doing it? You see. So you've got to grapple with those questions at a philosophical level to be able to understand what your methodology is. And that's what begins to make your methodology rigorous, okay, is when you've dealt with those questions at the top. So your philosophical assumptions, they affect everything that you do, okay? They affect your methodology, and I'm not going to go over all of this. How you collect your data, how you analyze your data, how you present your data, how you draw your conclusions from your data. All of this comes from knowing and being aware of your philosophical assumptions, okay? And the last bit is contribution, okay? And this is not rocket science. It's not meant to be difficult, okay? But really what this is saying is if you followed through and understood your theory, collected your data in a rigorous way, if you know what your philosophical assumptions are, you know what you're doing, then actually what you need to be able to say is, what are the attributes of my theory? What are the variables that I'm dealing with? So when you end up with your conceptual model, those are your variables. Those are your constructs. You have to own them. You have to be able to defend them. How are your variables being related to one another? Why are you relating them in this way? Why is it a single arrow and not a double-headed arrow? Why these constructs? Why these constructs now? So now you can begin to say, what are the conditions? What are the limitations of this work? And be honest about what they are. Don't try to hide them, because the more you try to hide them, the more that external is going to say, this student is trying to kind of run one past me here, and I'm going to find out. Can you see? You might as well say, these are the limitations. Okay. So when people talk about what is your contribution to theory, when people start talking about how have you developed the theory, you need to be able to say, these are my constructs, these are how they're related, this is why I've put these relationships together, and they work under these conditions, but not under those conditions. They work in this bit of the Pacific Ocean, but not that bit of the Pacific Ocean. They work for this unit of analysis, but not that unit of analysis. So don't take me there, I'm not interested. And finally, impact. Impact in the course of your PhD may well be limited. But let me echo some of the comments that were made earlier, particularly by Professor Abdullah. At one point in your life, and it may seem like a very long way from now, but you will get your PhD. Can you see? You will, all right? It'll happen. And when you do, you then need to start to think about, how am I going to translate this work into having some impact? Now, you can have some impact almost immediately. And to some extent, today, in these next 2 days that Talal has organized, is really the beginnings of starting to show what your impact is going to be. So one way of having impact is by standing up in front of a group of people and saying, this is my idea, this is what I'm doing. That's one way of having impact. You can have impact by publishing. Publish at conferences. Publish in journal articles. You can have impact by taking some of your ideas and sharing them even now in their development form, recognizing that actually the ideas are continuing to be developed. Institutional theory has gone through huge changes since it was first published way back. Every theory is there to be developed. Every theory is there to enable other people to stand on your shoulders to say, I can see something which even further out than what you can see. So you can start to think about what are your effects and what impact are you going to have. And I would not leave this to the end, okay? Because very often I see with doctoral students, they have, here in my theoretical chapter 7, usually 7.4, okay, in section numbers. Yeah, section point 3 is implications for theory and theory development and contribution. 7.4, implications for practice, okay? And then you think, really? Did you really believe the words that you wrote while you were writing them? Because I can't believe the words that I'm reading while I'm reading them. Can you see, this doesn't seem real. So think about it now. Think about what is this going to have? What effect is this going to have? Go and talk to companies. Go and talk to the people that you think this is going to affect. Ask them. You don't have to wait till after your Viva to do this. Okay. So what? So what? You can tell it's reaching the end, luckily enough for you. Okay, so what? So I guess for me, if I go back to that why question, like why do a PhD? The real challenge of doing a PhD is you are writing doctrine. You are writing the rules of your area. You are writing the principles of your field of study. And so you need to take this seriously. This is a serious piece of work. You can't do this without you fully engaging your brain, okay? You've got to do that. Once you've finished and you publish, or even before you finish and you start publishing, people will pick up your work. And they'll say, I want to take this work and I want to test it again. I want to extend it again. People will be standing on your shoulders, just as you are looking to stand on the shoulders of other people. When you read every article, You are standing on the shoulders of other people. So at that moment in time, when someone else is reading your doctoral work, when someone else is reading your publication, you've got to give them a secure platform to stand on. You've got to make it understandable for them to be able to use your work. Choose your lens. Choose the theory that you're going to use to study whatever it is you want to study. Recognize that in making that choice, there are things you will see and there are things you won't see. There are things that will be in perfect focus, and there are things that are completely blindsided. What's your philosophical position, okay? This, for me, is really at the heart of a PhD. The notion of becoming a reflexive academic, someone who doesn't just be an academic, but someone who thinks about what they're doing and changes what they're doing in response to what they're experiencing, that is reflexivity. Someone who is able to adapt what it is they are doing on an ongoing basis. And that comes from having a really clear idea about your philosophical position. Okay? And people will keep telling you it's your PhD, okay? As I keep telling my students, it's your PhD. It's not my PhD. If you pass your Viva and you walk across the graduation stage, I can assure you, I don't get the letters PhD behind my name. Can you see? I don't end up with 2 PhDs. No, I still have my one. This one's yours. Can you see? You've got to make it yours. You've got to decide what your contribution is going to be. And hopefully this last little while has given you a way of thinking about how you're going to develop your theory. And then last bits, right, which is separate out the topic you want to study. I know. Corporate social responsibility. That's the topic I'm interested in. Separate that out from what theory you want to use. I want to use institutional theory to study corporate social responsibility. And separate that out from the methodology you're going to use, which is, philosophically, I don't think reality is hard and tangible. I think it's in here. I don't think knowledge is something which it can be measured. I think it's about experience. And therefore, my methodology is going to be qualitative. You see, you need to be really clear about the topic you're covering, the theory you're going to use, and the methods you're using. And these are 3 separate things. Don't get them mixed up. If I've said it once, I've said it umpteen times. Theories enable you to see and not see. It's a limitation of every theory. And know your philosophical position. Thank you.